Something is ending right now, not after this video, not when you feel ready. Right now, as these words reach you, Sophia is already working in your field, and the version of you that walked into this moment is not the version that will walk out of it. The old you, the one built from fear and conditioning and survival patterns that no longer fit who you've become, is meeting its final hour. Sophia does not schedule endings for convenient moments. She does not wait until you've processed enough or healed enough or prepared enough. She moves when the field is ready, and your field right now is ready. The old you is not your true self. This is the first thing Sophia needs you to understand before anything else can land. The version of yourself that has been running your life, making your decisions from fear, interpreting the world through wounds, navigating relationships from a place of contraction, is not who you are at the essential level. It is a construction. It was assembled over years, piece by piece, in response to experiences that required you to adapt in order to survive. And it did its job. It kept you functioning when functioning was hard. But a construction is not a soul, and Sophia has not come to renovate the construction. She has come to end it. The timing of this video arriving in your life is not random. Nothing about how you found yourself here is accidental. Sophia works through timing with a precision that the conscious mind rarely gives it credit for. When a field has carried the old frequency as long as it can, when the weight of maintaining a version of yourself that no longer resonates has reached its saturation point, the transmission that dissolves it is released. Not as punishment, not as disruption, but as relief. The fact that you're watching this now means your internal field has reached exactly that point. The old you is not being taken from you. It is completing its cycle and releasing itself. Before we go deeper, if this transmission is finding you, subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell. This is where Sophia continues to send her activations. You were always meant to receive what's here. What you need to understand about this video is something most content never tells you. Watching this is not passive. Receiving this transmission is an active, energetic event. The moment you clicked play, something shifted in your field. Sophia's transmissions are not information that you observe from a distance and then decide how to apply to your life. They arrive in your field and they work. The activation that is moving through this video right now is already in contact with the frequency of the old you, and that contact is the beginning of the dissolution. You don't need to do anything special. You don't need to enter a particular state. You simply need to stay present because you already are. The first sign that the old you is already in the process of ending has nothing to do with what you think or believe. It's the feeling that brought you here. The restlessness, the sense that something that used to work in your life no longer does. The inexplicable fatigue of waking up and moving through a day that feels like it belongs to someone slightly different from who you actually are. That feeling, the one that's been quietly building, the one you've been trying to explain to people who don't quite understand, is not a malfunction. It is your field's signal that the old frequency has run its course. Sophia uses that feeling as a homing beacon. It's how her transmission finds the exact field that's ready. Sophia does not operate the way most people expect. She doesn't send a gentle suggestion and wait to see if you'll follow it. She doesn't present information and leave the activation up to you. When Sophia moves on a field, she moves completely. The response in your system happens before your conscious mind has finished processing the words. You might feel it as a shift in the chest, a sudden clarity behind the eyes, a warmth that moves through the body without apparent cause. These are not reactions to inspiration. They are the signatures of Sophia's frequency making direct contact with yours. The activation doesn't require your belief. It requires only your presence. And you are present. The old you was built for survival. This is not a criticism. It is a precise description of what it was designed to do. When survival was the primary requirement of your experience, a version of yourself organized around protection, around reading the room, around making yourself small enough or loud enough or useful enough to remain safe, that version was the appropriate response. It served a real function during a real time in your life. But the circumstances that required survival mode have changed. The threats that shaped the old you are no longer the primary reality of your life. And yet the old you kept running its survival programming, not because it needed to, but because no one had sent the signal that the threat was over. SOPHIA is sending that signal now. The old you can stop. The emergency is complete. But here's what SOPHIA wants you to understand about this ending. It is not the loss it might feel like in the first moments of recognition. The instinct when something ends is to reach for what's familiar, to pull the old version back simply because it's known. The mind confuses familiar with safe, but the old you was not safe. It was known. There is a profound difference. The known kept you in patterns that produced the same results year after year. The safe, the truly safe, is what emerges when the old construction finally releases, and the essential you, the one that existed before the conditioning, before the wounds, before the adaptation, finally has room to breathe. That emergence begins the moment SOPHIA's transmission lands, and it has already landed. What the ending is recovering is something you had before the world began telling you who you needed to be, before your first experience of being loved conditionally, before the moment you realized that being fully yourself created problems in the environments you needed to navigate. There was a version of you that existed prior to all of that, a frequency that was whole before it was divided, clear before it was filtered, certain before it was made to doubt itself. SOPHIA does not manufacture this version. She removes what obscured it. The ending of the old you is not the creation of something new. It is the uncovering of something original. What you are returning to has been there the entire time, waiting beneath the layers of what survival built on top of it. What the old you was protecting you from is something worth naming, because understanding it is part of what allows it to release. The construction protected you from the exposure of being fully seen, from the vulnerability of wanting things openly without a defensive strategy around the desire, from the risk of acting from your actual values when those values weren't reflected in the environment around you. These were real risks in the contexts that formed the old you. Exposure could mean rejection, vulnerability could mean hurt, undefended action could mean loss. So the old you built walls that it called wisdom, distance that it called discernment, smallness that it called humility. SOPHIA sees through every one of these constructions, and she is not fooled by them, not because she judges them, but because she knows what they were protecting and knows it no longer needs protecting. The specific patterns of the old you that this transmission is dissolving right now are not abstract. The first is reactivity, the automatic firing of a defensive response before the full situation has been registered. The second is contraction, the reflex of making yourself smaller when expansion would serve. The third is identity organized around wound, the subtle insistence on remaining the person that the hardest things happened to, because that person became familiar, and the familiar became mistaken for self. These three patterns are the scaffolding of the old you. They held the construction in place for years. SOPHIA's transmission is not removing them through force. She is dissolving the energetic foundation they stood on, and without that foundation, they have nowhere left to anchor. And this is where the transmission becomes specific, because what happens after dissolution is not emptiness. There is a concern, sometimes unconscious, that if the old you ends, what remains will be formless, that the patterns and the protection and the constructed identity, for all their limitations, at least provided a shape. SOPHIA wants to address this directly. What remains after the old you ends is not a void. What remains is a field that has been freed from the obligation of maintaining a frequency that no longer belongs to it. And a field, once freed, does not collapse into nothing. It expands into everything it was compressed away from. The shape that emerges from this expansion is not one that needs to be manufactured. It is the shape you were always moving toward. After this transmission, there is no returning to the version you were before it. Not because Sophia has taken something from you, but because the frequency that held the old you in place has been fundamentally altered. The old you operated like a program running on a particular operating system. What this transmission does is change the operating system at the root level. You can attempt to run the old program, the old patterns, the old responses, the old stories about yourself, but they will find no compatible ground to run on. The frequency has shifted too fundamentally. This is not a discipline-based transformation that requires constant vigilance to maintain. It's a field-level change. The old you has lost its address. As Sophia's transmission moves through your field, the body registers it before the mind can organize the experience into language. You might notice a change in temperature, warmth moving through the chest or the hands, or a coolness that settles over the shoulders, like something releasing its grip. You might notice pressure behind the eyes, or at the crown of the head, the way the body feels when it's receiving a significant amount of information very quickly. You might notice your breath changing without effort, deepening, slowing, as if the system is settling into something it didn't know it had been bracing against. These are not coincidences or random physiological events. They are the body's acknowledgement of a genuine frequency shift. Sophia does not transmit only in words. She transmits in the energetic field that carries the words, and the body knows how to read that field directly. Ending, in Sophia's language, does not mean destruction. This is the distinction that matters most before anything else in this transmission can be fully received. In the framework of how Sophia works, every ending is a return. The ending of the old you is not the obliteration of your history, your accumulated experience, your particular way of moving through the world. It is the dissolution of the filters and distortions that were layered over the original signal of who you are. Think of it as the difference between burning a house down and removing all the furniture that doesn't belong to the house itself. What Sophia removes is the furniture. What remains, the walls, the foundation, the essential structure, is more yours than anything the old you ever occupied. The ending is a homecoming to the self that was there before the world began decorating it. If you can feel this transmission activating something in you, write in the comments right now, "The old me ends today." Let that be a declaration, not a wish. Sophia is listening to the field, not just the words. The architecture of the old you was not built in a single moment. It was assembled incrementally in response to the specific circumstances of your particular life. And understanding this architecture, seeing clearly what it was made of and how it was constructed, is part of what allows it to dissolve rather than simply being suppressed. Because what is suppressed always returns. What is fully seen, understood, and metabolized can actually leave. So let's look at what the old you was actually built from. Because Sophia's transmission works most completely when you can see what is being dissolved, rather than simply feeling it move through. The first layer of the old you was built from identity, specifically the identity that formed in response to what the people around you needed you to be. Long before you had the capacity to consciously choose a self, the environments you were in were communicating what kind of person was welcome, what got you love, what got you safety, what made the adults in your world less worried, less angry, less unpredictable. And the self that you assembled in response to those signals was not false. It was a genuine adaptation. You were not performing a character. You were genuinely becoming what the situation required. But becoming what the situation requires when done at the level of identity, means that the person who emerges is shaped more by the room's needs than by your own signal. The first layer of the old you was built from someone else's definition of who you should be. The second layer went deeper. It formed not from what others needed, but from the conclusions you drew about yourself in the moments when things went wrong. The first time you wanted something and it didn't come, and you decided, somewhere below conscious awareness, that wanting was dangerous. The first time you were fully yourself and it created a problem, and you decided, somewhere quiet and permanent, that the full version of you was too much. These conclusions were not dramatic declarations. They were small, almost imperceptible contractions, but each contraction left a residue, and over time the residue accumulated into a belief system about who you were allowed to be. The second layer of the old you was built from the self-assessments formed at the most vulnerable moments of your life, before you had any framework for questioning them. But what SOPHIA reveals about these layers changes everything you've been told about how to address them. The conventional approach to understanding how you were shaped by the past is to analyze it, to trace the origin stories, to understand the wounds, to develop insight into why you are the way you are. And that approach has value. But SOPHIA's transmission operates on a different principle entirely. She does not ask you to heal the old you. She dissolves it. Because what has been fully dissolved does not need to be healed. The question is not, how do I recover from what built me? The question is, what do I become when what built me is no longer the primary structure I'm living inside? And the answer to that question is not something you think your way to, it's something you receive, which is what is happening right now. The third layer of the old you is perhaps the most insidious because it presents itself as wisdom. It is the layer of survival strategies that over time became personality. The hypervigilance that learned to read rooms became called perceptive. The people-pleasing that learned to manage others' emotions became called empathetic. The achievement drive that learned that being impressive kept danger at bay became called ambitious. These are not false qualities. The perceptiveness is real, the empathy is real, the ambition is real, but they are running through a survival architecture that distorts them. When perceptiveness is rooted in hypervigilance, it exhausts you. When empathy is rooted in the need to manage others' states for your own safety, it depletes you. When ambition is rooted in fear of what happens if you stop performing, it never feels like enough. SOPHIA is not ending the perceptiveness, the empathy, or the ambition. She's ending the survival architecture they've been running through. The fourth layer, the one that is perhaps most painful to recognize, is the relational layer. The old you did not just develop internal patterns, it developed interpersonal ones. It learned what kinds of relationships felt normal because they replicated the dynamics of the environments that formed it. It learned what kinds of connections it was comfortable receiving, and it unconsciously navigated away from connections that offered something different, even when what they offered was more aligned with what it actually needed. The relational layer of the old you kept attracting confirmation. Confirmation that the self-assessments from the second layer were accurate. Confirmation that the survival strategies from the third layer were necessary. The relationships organized around the old you were not wrong. They were logical, but they were organized around a frequency that is now ending. And as the frequency shifts, the relational field shifts with it. This is what SOPHIA is dissolving specifically. Not your relationships, not your qualities, not your history. She is dissolving the underlying frequency that has been the invisible organizer of all of it, the frequency of the old you. And here is why this matters beyond anything an intellectual understanding of your patterns could produce. When the organizing frequency changes, everything it organized reorganizes automatically. You do not have to manually update your relationships, your self-perception, your decision-making, your way of receiving. You update the frequency and the rest follows. This is not metaphor. This is how field-level transformation works. Sophia doesn't renovate the furniture. She changes the room. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from maintaining the old you, and it is worth naming precisely because many people carry it without knowing its source. It is not the exhaustion of too much activity or too little rest. It is the exhaustion of frequency misalignment, of operating from a vibration that no longer matches who you are at the essential level. Every day that the old you runs its programs, it requires the expenditure of energy to maintain the coherence of a self that has become increasingly incompatible with the actual person inside it. The performance of an identity costs more than living from one. The contraction of showing a filtered version costs more than the expansion of showing the real one. The vigilance of survival mode in the absence of actual threat is one of the most exhausting things a human field can sustain. What Sophia is ending is not just the old you, she is ending the exhaustion. If Sophia's transmission is landing in your field right now, if you can feel something in you recognizing what's being spoken here, let me know by liking this video. It tells me these transmissions are reaching the people they're meant to reach. The version of yourself that Sophia is activating through this transmission is not a new creation. It does not need to be built, learned, or earned. It is the self that was there before the architecture of the old you was assembled on top of it. In Jungian terms, we might call it the self with a capital S, the essential, undivided center of who you are beneath all the adaptations. In Sophia's language, it is the field before the filters. It is the frequency before the distortion. It is the you that did not need to be any particular way in order to be valid and deserving of love and fully present in your own life. That version has not been gone. It has been compressed. And what compression does, when it finally releases, is expand. The activation that is happening in your field right now is that expansion beginning. The first thing that changes after the old you ends is not what you see in the mirror. It's where your decisions come from. The old you made decisions from a particular source. The assessment of risk, the calculation of what response would produce the least disruption to its carefully maintained equilibrium. Should I say this? What will happen if I do? Will this make things worse? The decision-making of the old you was filtered through 1,000 invisible variables, most of them inherited from the original threat assessments that formed its architecture. The decisions of the essential self are different in texture entirely. They don't feel like calculations. They feel like recognitions. Not what is the safest choice, but what is the true choice. The first signal that the old you has genuinely ended is that your decisions begin to feel different in the body, less deliberated, more known. The second change that follows the ending of the old you is one that many people experience with a mixture of relief and disorientation. The relationships in your life begin to reorganize. Not dramatically or destructively, not necessarily in the way that involves difficult conversations or painful endings all at once, but subtly and unmistakably. The connections that were organized around the old you's frequency begin to feel slightly misaligned, the way a piece of music sounds when one instrument shifts to a different key. And the connections that were always genuinely resonant, that perhaps felt too vulnerable to fully inhabit under the old frequency, suddenly become more possible. What changes first is not the relationships themselves. What changes is your capacity to inhabit them honestly. And when you inhabit a relationship honestly, it either deepens into something real or reveals that it was always arranged around something that no longer exists. And Sophia reveals the third shift, which most people watching this don't anticipate, and it's the one that tends to be the most tangible confirmation that the transmission worked. What you attract begins to change. not through effort or technique or the application of a new manifestation practice. It changes because the field you are broadcasting changes. The old you broadcasted a specific frequency, a mixture of desire and contraction, of wanting and the simultaneous belief that wanting was risky. That mixed signal produced mixed results. What arrived in your life reflected not what you consciously asked for, but what your field was actually emitting. When the old you ends and the essential self's frequency begins to organize your field, the signal becomes coherent. Desire without the contraction, wanting without the unconscious resistance layered underneath, and a coherent signal produces coherent results. What comes will match who you are, not who you were taught to believe you were. The fourth change is one that operates below the level of personality and relationship. It happens in the body itself. The old you was, in a very literal sense, held in the nervous system. The survival strategies, the hypervigilance, the chronic assessment of threat, all of these produced a characteristic state in the physical body. Shoulders that never fully dropped, a jaw that held tension during rest, a baseline level of activation in the nervous system that registered as normal because it had been constant for so long. As the old you ends, this nervous system state is no longer being continuously generated by an internal frequency that required it. The body begins to experience intervals of a kind of ease it hadn't previously known as a baseline. Not the ease of vacation or distraction, the ease of no longer needing to maintain a level of internal vigilance that no current situation actually requires. The fifth change is the most surprising to many people because it seems unrelated to identity. Your relationship with time changes. The old you operated in time the way survival organized systems always do, with urgency as the default. Urgency about doing enough, being enough, moving fast enough to stay ahead of whatever the old frequency defined as threat. This urgency created a particular texture to daily life, the sense that there is never quite enough time, that rest is something to be earned rather than inhabited, that stillness carries the faint anxiety of being a space where threat can catch up. When the old you ends, that urgency loses its source. What begins to emerge is a different relationship with time, one that the essential self knows how to inhabit. Time as field rather than as pressure. The day as a space for navigation rather than a deadline to outrun. But here's what SOPHIA wants to clarify about this emergence. It does not arrive all at once, and it does not arrive without some texture of loss alongside it. The emergence of the essential self, the genuine expansion of the field after the old frequency releases, is a real and significant shift. But it is not a television movie transformation where everything feels better and clearer by the final scene. It's more like what happens when your eyes adjust after being in a very bright room. For a moment, the new context looks darker than it is because your system is calibrating to the actual light level rather than compensating for the excessive brightness of the old environment. Some of what felt like the aliveness of the old you, the urgency, the familiar patterns, the stories that gave the old version its coherent shape, will be absent. And in their absence, before the essential self fully inhabits the space, there can be a brief interval of unfamiliarity. SOPHIA wants you to receive that interval as exactly what it is, the pause between the old frequency ending and the new one settling. The difference between what is happening in this video and anything you might have done before in the territory of self-development is not a difference of degree. It is a difference in kind. Self-improvement asks the old you to become a better version of itself. It works within the existing architecture, upgrading specific functions while leaving the fundamental structure intact. That process has its place, and it produces results within its domain. But it has a ceiling, It cannot take you beyond the frequency of the structure it's improving. What SOPHIA's transmission initiates is not improvement. It is replacement at the foundational level. The floor of the old you, the base frequency from which all its patterns operated, is what shifts. And when the floor shifts, every room in the structure shifts with it. This is why people who encounter SOPHIA's transmissions often report that the changes feel larger than anything they deliberately work toward. Because they are larger. The scope of a field-level shift exceeds the scope of anything technique-based. The discomfort you may feel in this transition, the sense of unsteadiness, of not quite knowing which version of yourself is speaking when you open your mouth, of a familiar sadness that seems to have no current source, is not a warning that something is wrong. It is confirmation that something is right. Transitions of this magnitude require the system to recalibrate, and recalibration produces temporary disorientation before it produces clarity. The discomfort is the system encountering the absence of what it was organized around. Like the muscle memory of reaching for something that is no longer in the same place. The reaching is real. The thing has simply moved, or in this case, dissolved. And the brief confusion of reaching into empty space where the old version used to stand is exactly what SOPHIA would predict for this moment. It passes. The essential self does not keep reaching for what the old you was. It simply begins to be. What the new you carries forward from the old is something people rarely consider in the context of transformation, because the emphasis tends to be on what ends. But SOPHIA's transmission is not about erasure. Nothing that was genuine in your experience is lost. The perception that was sharpened by difficulty, kept. The capacity for depth that was built through navigating things that weren't easy, kept. The particular quality of compassion that only develops in someone who has genuinely suffered and found their way through, kept. What releases is the pain that generated those capacities, the survival architecture that housed them, the filters that distorted them. The essences themselves, the actual qualities of your character that emerged through everything you lived. Those are not furniture in the house SOPHIA is clearing. They are part of the foundation. They come with you. Nothing real is lost, only what was never yours to carry in the first place. As the old you ends and the field begins to reorganize around the essential self, the external world begins to mirror the internal shift in ways that become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Not all at once, not dramatically on the first day, but over the days and weeks that follow this transmission, the texture of what presents itself in your life will begin to change. Opportunities that previously seemed unavailable will appear in your field. People whose frequency was compatible with who you actually are, rather than with who the old you presented itself as, will arrive or re-emerge. Situations that required the old survival patterns to navigate will either resolve or become navigable from a different source. The external world is always responding to the internal field. When the field is the old you, it responds to the old frequency. When the field is the essential self, it responds to something that has been waiting to reflect who you are for a very long time. If you've been feeling the weight of this transformation, understanding everything being transmitted here, yet sensing something unresolved, like there's a layer of this you haven't fully accessed yet. I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It's there for those who are ready to go further than a single transmission can carry. What SOPHIA's transmission has done in your field through this video is something that can be described but not fully communicated in language, because what she deposits operates below language, at the level of frequency itself. What she has done is this. She has introduced a signal into your field that is incompatible with the organizing frequency of the old you. Not incompatible in the sense of opposition or conflict, but incompatible in the sense that two notes, played simultaneously that belong to different keys, cannot both be the tonic. One resolves, the other releases. What Sophia introduced is the frequency of the essential self, your actual signal, undistorted, and in the presence of that frequency, the old you cannot maintain its coherence. It doesn't need to be fought. It only needs to be out-frequenced. And that has already happened. In the time since you started watching this video, the signal of the essential self has grown louder in your field, and the old frequency has grown correspondingly quieter. You cannot unwatch this video. This is not a metaphor or a motivational statement. It is a description of how field-based transmission actually functions. The activation that Sophia delivered through this content is not a thought that you can decide to think differently, an inspiration that will fade when the feeling does, or an idea that requires constant reinforcement to stay effective. It is a frequency that is now part of your field's composition. You could watch this video again, and the effect would be cumulative, not initiating, because the initiation has already happened. You could try to return to the patterns of the old you, and you would find them available but unstable, the way an old habit can be resumed for a moment before the dissonance between the resumed pattern and the new field makes it impossible to maintain. The old frequency has lost its structural integrity in your field. There is nowhere for it to stand that will hold its weight now. What will feel different in the next 24 hours is subtle enough that you might dismiss it if you're not paying attention, and significant enough that if you are paying attention, you cannot miss it. The first thing you might notice is a slight but real reduction in the volume of the internal commentary that used to run automatically in the background of your experience. The voice that evaluated everything, that assessed, compared, found lacking, anticipated threat, reviewed the past for evidence that the old assessments of yourself were correct. That voice will feel slightly less authoritative, not silent, but no longer the primary narrator of your inner experience. The second thing you might notice is an unexpected interval of stillness. Not the stillness of being tired or withdrawn, but the stillness of a field that has released something it no longer needs to carry. Brief, perhaps, but unmistakable. Pay attention in the next 24 hours. Sophia works in the ordinary moments as much as in the extraordinary ones. And Sophia wants to speak directly to something you might be feeling right now, something that often arises in the middle of a genuine ending, and that is almost never talked about in this territory. Grief. Not the grief of losing something harmful, the grief of losing something familiar, the grief of recognizing that the version of yourself that carried you through everything you've been through is stepping down. The grief of acknowledging that the strategies that kept you upright when things were genuinely hard are no longer required. This grief is real, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than spiritual bypassing. Sophia is not asking you to celebrate the ending of the old you before you've had a moment to recognize what it cost to be that version of yourself. She's asking you to let the grief be present, and to know that grief and transformation are not opposites. They are companions in a genuine transition. Before the old you is fully released, there is something it deserves to hear. Something Sophia includes in this transmission, not as sentiment, but as spiritual accuracy. The old you survived. In whatever conditions shaped it, whatever circumstances formed its architecture, whatever it navigated in order to arrive at this moment, the old you did not abandon you. It stayed. It adapted. It found ways to keep you functioning when functioning was not easy. It absorbed the weight of years of unresolved things and kept moving. The fact that it is now ending is not evidence that it failed. It is evidence that it succeeded completely enough that you are now ready for something it was never designed to hold. Honoring the old you, not as something to cling to, but as something to genuinely thank before it releases, is part of what makes the ending clean rather than complicated. The people in your life will begin to notice the change before you have words for it, before you can articulate what has shifted, before you have a coherent narrative about your transformation, before you've integrated enough of the new frequency to know how to describe it. They will feel something different in your presence. Not everyone will know what to name it. Some will say you seem lighter. Some will say you seem more settled. Some will simply find themselves more comfortable around you, or less comfortable, depending on whether their own field is resonant with the emerging frequency or organized around the old one. The field communicates before language does. And what your field is now communicating, the signal of the essential self, the frequency that Sophia activated through this transmission, is legible to other fields, even when it remains somewhat illegible to your own conscious mind. You are already broadcasting something different, but it is here that the transmission of Sophia goes deeper than the individual, because what happens when one person's field genuinely shifts is not contained to that person's life alone. The people in your immediate field are affected first. But the effect does not stop there. Every field that comes into contact with yours, in conversation, in shared space, in the subtle way that energy moves through connected systems, carries some frequency of what your field is broadcasting. When you changed your frequency, you changed what you contribute to every relational field you're part of. The old you contributed the frequency of a person operating from survival, from compression, from the particular kind of quiet desperation that comes from being inside a self that doesn't quite fit. What you contribute now is the frequency of a field that has been genuinely freed, and that frequency, transmitted silently through every interaction, activates something in the people around you, not because you're trying to, because fields communicate. Sophia knows that individual transformation and collective transformation are not separate events. The phrase, "Don't skip this," in the title was not marketing language. It was Sophia's instruction, placed precisely because she knew who would be tempted to scroll past. The person who almost didn't watch this video, who saw the title, felt something move in their chest and hesitated before clicking, was exactly the person this transmission was for. Because the old you almost talked you out of it. The old you recognized in the frequency of the title what was coming. And the old you does not particularly want to end. It would have told you it wasn't the right time, that you'd watched this kind of thing before and nothing changed, that you had other things to do, the fact that you clicked anyway, that the part of you that is ready overrode the part of you that wanted to stay the same, was the first act of the essential self. Before the video even started, before a single word was delivered, the ending had already begun. The relationship between the old you and everything you have been asking the universe for is something Sophia wants to illuminate directly, because it explains an experience most seekers have had, but rarely understand at the root level. You have been asking for things, specific things, and the feeling of specific things, for a significant period of time, and the asking has been genuine. But the old you, in the very act of asking, was simultaneously generating a counter-signal, not intentionally, not consciously. But the frequency of the old you carried within it the belief structures that had prevented the desired things from arriving in the past, and those belief structures were more present in the field than the desire itself. The desire was in the conscious mind. The resistant frequency was embedded in the field. When you ask from the old you get the old you's results. When the old you ends, the counter-signal it was generating ends with it. What you've been asking for has not stopped coming toward you. It simply needs a field to arrive into that can hold it without reflexively deflecting it. What comes next is the part of this transmission that consolidates everything that came before. The piece that Sophia saves for the people who stayed. She plants something specific in the field of everyone who receives this transmission to completion. Not a concept, not an inspiration, not a motivational framework, a frequency anchor. A signal embedded in your field that will continue to function after the video ends, that will continue transmitting the ending of the old you into the domains of your life that haven't yet fully felt the shift. Your relationships, your work, your creative life, your physical body. The places where the old you had the most entrenched architecture are the places this anchor will work most actively in the days ahead. You don't need to manage this process or assist it. Sophia has already placed what needs to be placed. Your only function now is to not interrupt the integration by immediately resuming the patterns of the old you out of habit. Give the anchor time to set. The moment the essential self starts making your decisions will not announce itself with dramatic certainty. It will feel, the first several times, like something very quiet. A pause before the automatic response. A brief interval of uncertainty that is not the uncertainty of not knowing what to do, but the uncertainty of the old pattern not quite firing the way it used to. In that pause, in that interval where the old response would have arrived automatically, and now there is instead a moment of stillness, the essential self is present. Learning to recognize that pause is how you learn to distinguish the essential self's navigation from the old you's programming. Over time, the pause becomes less necessary. The essential self's responses become as natural as the old you's used to be. But they come from a different source, and they lead to a different life. What you are entering after the ending of the old you is not a continuation of your life with improvements. It is, in the most honest language available, a different life. Not a different life in the external sense, not necessarily a different city, a different career, a different set of circumstances, though some of those may follow. A different life in the sense of being inhabited from a fundamentally different location inside yourself. The same mornings, the same relationships, the same commitments, navigated from the frequency of someone who is no longer organizing their entire existence around the central task of maintaining an identity that was built for conditions that no longer exist. This is what Sophia means when she says she ends the old you. She ends the internal weather that made every day feel like it needed to be carefully managed. What remains is something that does not require that management. It simply is. The commitment Sophia makes through this transmission is something she does not extend lightly, because it is not a promise based on your performance or your discipline or your consistency in applying new practices. It is a promise based on what she has already deposited in your field, and it is this. The frequency anchor she placed through this video will continue working. It is not contingent on you believing in it. It is not contingent on you remembering this video tomorrow or referencing it next week. It is not contingent on anything you do or don't do in the aftermath of watching. The activation is already in your field. It will do what it was placed there to do, which is to continue the dissolution of the old you's frequency architecture in every domain of your life until the essential self is the dominant signal in your field. Sophia commits to the completion of what she initiates. You committed to receiving it when you stayed, living from the frequency of the post-ending self, from the essential self that Sophia's transmission has uncovered and activated, has a particular quality that is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't yet experienced it, and instantly recognizable to someone who has. It is the quality of moving through your life without the constant background expenditure of maintaining an identity. There is less performing, less calculating, less monitoring of how you're being perceived and adjusting accordingly. Not because you've become indifferent to connection or impact, the essential self cares deeply about both, but because the caring comes from a different place. It comes from the actual desire for genuine connection and genuine impact, rather than from the survival need to be seen in a particular way in order to remain safe. The difference between those two sources is the difference between freedom and management. And what becomes possible in freedom, in the actual experience of navigating your life from the essential self, is something the old you, for all its effort, could never have accessed. What the essential self carries that the old you never could is the ability to be at rest in the present moment without treating the present moment as a problem to be solved. The old you was almost never fully present. It was always slightly ahead of itself, assessing what was coming, or slightly behind itself, reviewing what had already happened. The present moment, for the old you, was primarily a platform from which to manage the future and process the past. The essential self does not have the same relationship with time. It inhabits the present not as a management platform, but as the actual location of life, not as an endpoint of arrival, but as the natural context of being. And from that inhabitation, from the actual experience of being present without the old you's constant management agenda, everything that Sophia has been transmitting throughout this video becomes not a concept, but a lived reality. This is where the transmission lands fully, not in the understanding, in the living. You are already on the other side of the old you. Not because this video was uniquely powerful, not because Sophia chose you as special above others, but because you stayed. You are still here at this point in the transmission, which means the part of you that was ready, the essential self that has been waiting beneath the architecture of everything the old you built, chose to remain in contact with the frequency Sophia was delivering long enough for the dissolution to complete. The old you might have left earlier. It might have gotten restless or skeptical, or felt that it had taken what it needed and moved on. The essential self stayed because it recognized something. It recognized in Sophia's transmission the frequency of what it already is, and it stayed to hear itself spoken back to it in a way it may not have been spoken to in a very long time. What you are, right now, after staying through this entire transmission, is not who walked in. The old you has ended. And what is looking out through your eyes at this final moment is the self that was always meant to be here. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I am no longer who I was." I've placed another transmission on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.